In the winter of 1851, in the remote hills of northern Georgia, a farmhouse burned through the night. When neighbors finally arrived at dawn, they found the bodies of the Harlan family scattered throughout the property. Marcus Harlan, the landowner, his wife, Judith, their two eldest sons, William and Robert, and their teenage daughter, Catherine. 5 people, dead in a single night of violence that witnesses would later describe as methodical, calculated, and absolutely merciless. But there was a survivor. A baby girl, barely 8 months old, found unharmed in her cradle, wrapped in clean blankets, with a fresh bottle of warm milk beside her. The child who should have died with her family. The child whose life was deliberately spared. And sitting on the porch of the burning house, covered in blood that wasn't his own, was a man named Isaiah. A man who had been enslaved by the Harlan family for 23 years. A man who had just committed an act that would define the rest of his life and the life of the child he chose to save. This is the story of what happens when revenge meets innocence, when justice collides with mercy. When a man destroys everything his oppressor built, then becomes the father to their last surviving child. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if this is your first time on the channel, subscribe, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about revenge, redemption, and the thin line between monster and man. The Harlan farm sat on 200 acres of rocky Georgia soil, 20 miles from the nearest town of Gainesville. It wasn't a grand plantation with hundreds of slaves and white columns. It was a working farm, modest by Southern standards, sustained by the labor of just 7 enslaved people and the Harlan family's own brutal efficiency. Marcus Harlan was a man of 45, built like an ox with hands that could break a man's jaw with a single blow. He had inherited the property from his father and expanded it through a combination of shrewd business sense and absolute cruelty. He believed that slaves needed to understand their place through fear, not kindness, that mercy was weakness, that every act of defiance required public punishment to maintain order. Isaiah had been born on the Harlan property in 1828. His mother, Ruth, had been purchased by Marcus's father when she was pregnant. Isaiah never knew his father, sold before his birth to a plantation in Alabama. His mother died when he was 12, from fever and exhaustion after working 3 straight days in the fields during harvest. But Isaiah was different from other enslaved children. He was intelligent, observant, with a memory that retained every detail, every pattern, every piece of information that came his way. Marcus Harlan recognized this intelligence early and made a calculated decision. He assigned Isaiah to work in and around the main house, training him as a general laborer, someone who could fix things, build things, handle the tasks that required a thinking mind. It was a double-edged privilege. Isaiah had better food, lighter physical labor, and access to the main house. But it also meant he saw everything, every cruelty, every injustice, every moment of casual violence that Marcus inflicted on the other enslaved people. He became a witness to horrors that field workers never saw, trapped in proximity to the family's darkest moments. By 1851, at 23 years old, Isaiah had learned to make himself invisible. He moved through the house like a ghost, repairing furniture, fixing broken tools, maintaining the property. The Harlans spoke freely around him, as if he had no ears, no memory, no human capacity to understand or judge what he witnessed. Isaiah had also learned skills that would later prove crucial. Marcus, always looking for free labor, had taught him carpentry, basic metalwork, animal husbandry. Isaiah could build, repair, improvise solutions to practical problems. He had learned to think several steps ahead, to anticipate needs, to plan and execute complex tasks. The Harlan family consisted of Marcus and his wife Judith, a cold woman of 42 who saw enslaved people as equipment, not humans. Their eldest son, William, 19, had inherited his father's cruelty but lacked his discipline. He enjoyed inflicting pain for its own sake, creating games of humiliation that left psychological scars deeper than any whip. Robert, 17, was quieter but no less cruel, with a calculating nature that made him unpredictable and dangerous. The daughter, Catherine, 15 years old, had begun to demonstrate the same contempt for enslaved people that characterized her entire family. She had learned from her mother that cruelty was a woman's duty, that maintaining racial hierarchy required constant vigilance and occasional violence. And then there was the baby. Emma, born in March 1851 to Judith Harlan at the age of 42, an unexpected late pregnancy that had left Judith bedridden for months and created additional burdens for the household. Isaiah had witnessed Emma's birth, had been in the house that night when the midwife arrived, when Judith's screams echoed through the rooms. He had seen Marcus pace the floors, unusually nervous, revealing a capacity for concern that Isaiah had never witnessed directed toward enslaved people. The baby had changed something in the house's atmosphere. For the first time in Isaiah's memory, there was genuine joy in the Harlan household. Marcus smiled when he held his daughter. Judith sang lullabies. Even William and Robert showed uncharacteristic gentleness around their baby sister. Isaiah observed all of this with the careful attention that had kept him alive for 23 years. He noticed how the family's guard dropped around the infant, how their routines changed to accommodate her needs, how the baby required feeding every few hours, how she cried at specific times, how her presence created predictable patterns in the household's rhythm. But Isaiah also witnessed other things during this period. In the summer of 1851, a young enslaved woman named Sarah tried to run away. She was caught 3 miles from the property, brought back, and made an example of. Marcus gathered all 7 enslaved people in the yard and forced them to watch as he beat Sarah with a leather strap until she couldn't stand. Isaiah watched in silence, his face carefully neutral, as Marcus explained that this was mercy, that other owners would have sold Sarah down the river, separated her from her young son, that the Harlans were kind masters who simply needed to maintain discipline. Sarah died 2 days later from her injuries. Her 5-year-old son, Thomas, cried for 3 days straight until William Harlan threatened to sell him if he didn't stop making noise. The child learned to cry silently, a skill that broke something fundamental in Isaiah's heart. It was Thomas who changed everything. Isaiah had watched the boy grow from infant to child, had seen his personality develop, his curiosity about the world. Thomas reminded Isaiah of himself at that age. Before life had taught him that curiosity was dangerous, that questions led to punishment. In September 1851, Thomas made a mistake. He was playing near the main house and accidentally broke a window with a thrown rock. It was a child's accident, meaningless, easily fixed. But William Harlan decided it required correction. Isaiah was working in the barn when he heard the screams. He ran toward the sound and found William holding Thomas by the arm, the boy's feet barely touching the ground. William was laughing, explaining to the crying child that he needed to learn the cost of damaging Harlan property. What happened next would haunt Isaiah for the rest of his life. William dragged Thomas to the well, held him upside down over the opening, and slowly lowered him into the darkness. The child's screams echoed up from the depths, terrified, primal. William held him there for what felt like an eternity, then pulled him back up, dropped him gasping on the ground, and walked away laughing. Isaiah watched from the barn doorway, his hands clenched into fists so tight his nails drew blood from his palms. He couldn't intervene. Any attempt to stop William would result in punishment for both Isaiah and Thomas. The system was designed this way, to make witnesses of the enslaved, to force them to participate in their own degradation through inaction. That night, Thomas developed a fever. By morning, he was delirious. By afternoon, he was dead. The doctor who examined him said it was pneumonia, probably from the cold well water. But Isaiah knew the truth. William Harlan had killed a 5-year-old child over a broken window. The other enslaved people buried Thomas in the small cemetery at the edge of the property. His mother, Sarah, was already there, her grave still fresh. Now they lay side by side. mother and child reunited in death because of Harlan cruelty. It was at Thomas's graveside, on that October afternoon in 1851, that Isaiah made his decision. He didn't make it in anger or passion. He made it with the cold, calculated precision that had allowed him to survive 23 years of bondage. The Harlans had to pay, not just Marcus, but the entire family that had created and sustained this system of horror. Every member who had participated, who had benefited, who had turned away from the suffering they caused. But even in that moment of decision, standing over a child's grave, Isaiah drew a line. Emma, the baby, was innocent. She had committed no crimes, made no choices, inflicted no cruelty. She would live. He would make sure of it. Isaiah began to plan. The autumn of 1851 brought an early cold to northern Georgia. Frost covered the fields by mid-October, and the Harlan household prepared for winter with the usual efficiency. Marcus ordered wood chopped and stacked. Judith organized the preservation of vegetables and meat. The enslaved people worked longer hours, preparing the property for months of isolation. Isaiah worked silently, but every action now had a purpose beyond mere obedience. He was studying, learning, preparing. Marcus had always kept his rifle loaded and mounted above the fireplace in the main house. It was a symbol of his authority, his readiness to defend his property. But Isaiah had noticed something over the years. Marcus never actually cleaned or maintained the weapon properly. It was decorative, a threat more than a tool. Isaiah also knew that Marcus kept a pistol in his bedroom nightstand, loaded and ready. This weapon Marcus actually used, taking it when he traveled to town or dealt with potentially dangerous situations. It was well maintained, reliable. The household had a routine that had solidified around the baby's needs. Emma woke twice during the night for feeding. Judith, exhausted from the pregnancy and still recovering, had hired a wet nurse from town, a free black woman named Grace, who came each evening and stayed until dawn. Grace slept in a small room off the kitchen, close enough to hear when Emma cried. Isaiah noted every detail. The house had 6 bedrooms upstairs. Marcus and Judith slept in the master bedroom. William had a room at the east end. Robert's room was at the west end. Catherine slept in a small room adjacent to her parents, and Emma's nursery was between Catherine's room and the master bedroom, positioned so Judith could hear her daughter's cries. The stairs creaked on the 3rd and 7th steps from the bottom. The back door to the kitchen had a tendency to stick in cold weather. The front door had a lock that could only be secured from inside. There were no dogs on the property, Marcus having sold them the previous year after they killed several chickens. Isaiah also studied the family's weapons. Besides the rifles and pistol, Marcus kept a collection of knives in the kitchen, tools he used for butchering livestock. Large, sharp, well maintained. Isaiah had sharpened those knives himself, knew their weight, their balance, how easily they could cut through flesh and bone. During late October, Isaiah began making small preparations. He collected supplies, hiding them in various locations around the property. A spare blanket in the barn, food that wouldn't spoil in a hollow tree, a tinderbox with flint and steel buried near the property's northern boundary. He was preparing an escape route, supplies for a journey he might not survive, but was determined to attempt. He also began manipulating the household routine in subtle ways. When asked to repair a window latch in William's room, he deliberately left it slightly loose. Nothing obvious, but enough that a strong push would open it from outside. When cleaning the fireplace in Marcus's bedroom, he noted the exact location of everything in the room, memorizing where Marcus left his clothes, his pocket watch, his keys. Isaiah knew he would have one chance. One night when everything aligned perfectly. When surprise and speed could overcome the numerical advantage of the Harlan family. When his years of observation and preparation would culminate in a single, irreversible act. The opportunity came in November. Marcus announced he would be traveling to Gainesville for 3 days on business, leaving on a Monday morning. It was unusual for Marcus to travel alone, but he was meeting with potential buyers for the spring harvest and preferred to negotiate without family present. The night before Marcus's departure, Isaiah lay awake in the small cabin he shared with two other enslaved men, staring at the ceiling, calculating every step of what was to come. He felt no fear, no anxiety, only a cold, determined certainty that had been building for months. He thought about Thomas, about Sarah, about his mother Ruth, about all the lives that had been destroyed on this property. He thought about the countless cruelties he had witnessed, the casual violence, the systematic dehumanization. And he thought about Emma, the innocent baby who represented both the future of the Harlan legacy and its potential redemption. Isaiah had made his decision months ago, but now he refined the details. He would wait until Marcus was a day's travel away, ensuring no possibility of his return. He would act on Tuesday night, when the household would be relaxed in the master's absence, guards down, routines comfortable and predictable. Tuesday, November 11th, 1851. The day began like any other. Isaiah woke before dawn, as he always did. He went through his morning routine with mechanical precision, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, bringing firewood to the main house kitchen. The enslaved people ate their small breakfast of corn mush and worked through the morning at their assigned tasks. Judith Harlan seemed more relaxed with Marcus away. She moved through the house giving orders, but without the edge of tension that usually characterized her behavior. William and Robert took advantage of their father's absence to sleep late, emerging around mid-morning and spending the day hunting in the nearby woods. Catherine practiced her needlework in the parlor, occasionally checking on Emma in the nursery. Grace, the wet nurse, went about her duties with quiet efficiency, feeding the baby, changing her clothes, singing soft lullabies that drifted through the house. Isaiah worked on repairs to the barn roof, visible from the house, establishing his presence, his normalcy, his invisibility. But his mind was entirely focused on the night to come. He had rehearsed every movement, every step, every contingency. He knew exactly what he would do, in what order, with what tools. As afternoon faded to evening, Isaiah finished his work and returned to the slave quarters. He ate dinner with the others, a thin stew of vegetables and a small piece of salt pork. The other enslaved people talked quietly about the day's work, about the cold weather coming, about small concerns and small hopes. Isaiah listened but said little, as was his habit. After dinner, he returned to his cabin and waited. He had told the others he felt unwell, needed to rest. They accepted this without question. Isaiah often kept to himself, lost in thoughts that he never shared. At 8 o'clock, the main house began its nightly routine. Candles were lit. Shutters were closed against the November cold. William and Robert returned from their hunt, carrying 2 rabbits they had shot. Grace prepared Emma for bed, feeding her one last time before the long night ahead. By 9 o'clock, most of the house was quiet. Catherine retired to her room. Judith read in the parlor for an hour, then went upstairs to bed. William and Robert stayed up late drinking whiskey in the kitchen, talking and laughing about their day's hunt, before finally stumbling upstairs around 11. Isaiah waited in his cabin until midnight. Then he dressed in dark clothes, took the large knife he had hidden under his mattress, and walked silently across the yard toward the main house. The back door stuck slightly, as it always did in cold weather, but Isaiah knew how to lift and push simultaneously to open it without noise. He entered the kitchen, his eyes already adjusted to the darkness. The house was completely silent except for the creaking sounds of old wood settling in the cold. He moved through the kitchen toward the staircase, his bare feet silent on the wooden floors. He knew which boards creaked, which to avoid. He had walked this path 1,000 times over 23 years, always as a servant, always as property. Tonight he walked it as something else entirely. At the base of the stairs, Isaiah paused. This was the moment. Once he climbed these stairs, there would be no turning back, no possibility of return to the life he had known. Whatever happened next would define the rest of his existence. He thought of Thomas's face as William held him over the well. He thought of Sarah's broken body after Marcus finished beating her. He thought of his mother, worked to death in these fields. And he climbed the stairs, skipping the 3rd and 7th steps, moving like a ghost through the darkness. William's room was first. The window latch Isaiah had loosened still worked, opening silently when he pushed from inside. William slept deeply, his breath heavy with whiskey. Isaiah stood over him for a moment, looking at the young man who had killed a child for amusement. What happened next was quick, efficient, and absolutely final. Isaiah had butchered livestock for the Harlan family for years. He knew exactly where to cut, how deep, how to ensure death came quickly and quietly. William never woke up, never knew what happened, never felt anything beyond the first moment of pain. Robert was next, in his room at the west end of the hall. He was a lighter sleeper than his brother, but Isaiah's approach was practiced and silent. Robert's eyes opened just before the end, widening in recognition and terror. Isaiah saw the understanding dawn in those eyes, the realization of who stood over him and why, before the light went out forever. Catherine presented a different moral calculation. She was 15, still a child in many ways, but she had already internalized the cruelty of her family. She had laughed when William tortured Thomas. She had called the enslaved people animals, had slapped Grace across the face when Emma cried too long. But she was still so young, still potentially capable of change, of becoming something other than what her family had made her. Isaiah stood at her doorway, knife in hand, and wrestled with his conscience. Could he kill a 15-year-old girl? Could he justify adding her death to the others? She hadn't pulled the trigger, hadn't directly murdered anyone, but she had participated in the system, had benefited from the suffering, had shown no mercy to those beneath her. In the end, Isaiah made a calculation. Catherine would raise the alarm. She would scream, "Wake Judith, wake Grace, destroy any chance of completing what he'd started. And if she survived, she would inherit the property, continue the Harlan legacy, own and abuse other enslaved people just as her father had." Catherine died in her sleep, never knowing what happened, her face peaceful in the darkness. Then Isaiah came to Judith's room. Marcus and Judith's bedroom, the master bedroom, the heart of the house where all decisions about the enslaved people's lives had been made. Judith slept alone in the large bed, Marcus's absence leaving empty space beside her. Isaiah thought about all the times Judith had looked through him as if he didn't exist. All the orders she'd given through tight lips, all the cruelties she'd authorized with a casual wave of her hand. She had never beaten anyone herself, had never directly inflicted violence, but she had created and maintained the system that made all violence possible. Judith woke just before the end. Her eyes opened, found Isaiah standing over her in the darkness, and she understood immediately. Not the specifics, but the general truth. The enslaved had risen. The system had failed. Her world was ending. She tried to scream, but Isaiah was faster. It was over in seconds, and then the Harlan family was gone. 5 people who had built their prosperity on the suffering of others, eliminated in less than 30 minutes of calculated, methodical violence. Isaiah stood in the center of the blood-soaked bedroom, breathing hard, covered in the evidence of what he'd done. He had become what the Harlans had always feared, the enslaved person who fought back, the property that decided it was human after all. But he wasn't finished. He went to Emma's nursery, where the baby slept peacefully in her cradle, unaware that her entire family had just been erased from existence. He stood over her, this innocent child, this last remnant of the Harlan bloodline. Isaiah could have ended it there. One more death, and the Harlan line would be completely extinct. No heirs, no legacy, nothing remaining of their 23 years of cruelty to him and countless others. But he had drawn a line. Emma was innocent. She had made no choices, committed no crimes, inflicted no suffering. She was 8 months old, completely dependent, absolutely helpless. Isaiah carefully lifted the baby from her cradle, wrapped her in clean blankets, and carried her downstairs to the kitchen. He prepared a bottle of warm milk, knowing from observation how Judith and Grace had done it 100 times. He fed Emma slowly, watching her drink, her tiny hands grasping at the bottle. Grace, the wet nurse, was sleeping in her small room off the kitchen. Isaiah woke her gently, and when she saw him covered in blood, holding the baby, her eyes widened in terror and understanding. Isaiah spoke his first direct words to another human being in hours. "The Harlans are dead. All of them except this child. I need you to take her somewhere safe. Away from here. Tell them you found her in the house after a robbery. Tell them anything, but take her away from this place." Grace looked at Isaiah, at the blood on his clothes, at the peaceful baby in his arms. She was a free black woman, but she understood the system, understood what Isaiah had done and why. She nodded slowly. "I can't take her," Grace said quietly. "They'll question a black woman showing up with a white baby. They'll know something happened. But you..." She paused, considering. "You're the only one who can protect her now. You're the only one who knows what happened. If you disappear with her, they'll think you kidnapped her. Maybe she's still alive. If I take her, they'll investigate, find the bodies, and the baby becomes evidence." Isaiah hadn't considered this. He had assumed he would flee alone, that Grace would take Emma to safety while he vanished into the night. But Grace was right. The logic was inescapable. If he wanted Emma to survive, if he wanted to protect the only innocent member of the Harlan family, he would have to take her himself. And so Isaiah made a second decision that night, one that would prove far more complicated and far-reaching than the first. He would not only spare Emma's life, he would raise her as his own. Act 2. B. The escape and transformation, 12 to 20 minutes. The flight, 12 to 15 minutes. Isaiah left the Harlan property at 2 in the morning on November 12, 1851, carrying Emma wrapped in blankets, with a bag of supplies he had hidden weeks earlier. Grace helped him gather additional necessities. More blankets, food that would last several days, a water skin, and most importantly, papers that Grace forged documenting Isaiah as a free black man named Josiah Freeman, traveling with his infant daughter. The forgery was crude but might survive casual inspection. Grace had learned to read and write, skills she used to create documents for escaped slaves attempting to reach the North. She worked quickly by candlelight, creating a birth certificate for Emma, now renamed Emma Freeman, and freedom papers for Isaiah, now Josiah. "The story," Grace said as she worked, "is that your wife died in childbirth. You're traveling to relatives in Tennessee. Don't volunteer information, but if asked, stay consistent. The baby is your daughter. Her mother was light-skinned, which explains the Emma's appearance. You're grieving, which explains why you're quiet. People won't question a grieving father too deeply." Before leaving, Isaiah did one final thing. He set fire to the Harlan house, ensuring that evidence of exactly how the family died would be obscured. The fire would consume the bodies, destroy the crime scene, create confusion about what had actually happened. It would buy him time. As he walked away from the burning house, carrying Emma, Isaiah looked back once. Flames consumed the building where he had been enslaved for 23 years, where his mother had died, where Thomas had been tortured, where Sarah had been beaten to death. The fire burned orange against the night sky, destroying the past, creating a future he couldn't yet imagine. The journey north was harder than Isaiah had anticipated. Emma cried frequently, needed constant feeding and attention. Isaiah had observed Judith and Grace caring for the baby, but observation was different from actual practice. He struggled to warm milk without fire, to keep Emma clean without proper facilities, to soothe her crying without waking suspicion from other travelers. They traveled mostly at night, avoiding main roads, following paths Isaiah had learned about from other enslaved people who had attempted escape over the years. He knew which towns had slave catchers, which areas were patrolled, where sympathetic free black communities might offer temporary shelter. On the third night, Emma developed a fever. Isaiah, terrified the baby would die, sought help at a small black church outside Chattanooga. The pastor, a free black man named Reverend James Crawford, took them in without questions. His wife, Martha, examined Emma and diagnosed a simple cold, nothing serious, but requiring rest and warmth. The Crawfords let them stay for 3 days. During this time, Isaiah had his first real conversations with other free black people. The Crawfords knew he was running from something, that his papers were probably forged, that his story about a dead wife was likely incomplete. But they didn't press for details. What they did do was teach him. Martha showed him how to properly care for an infant, how to prepare food, how to recognize signs of illness, how to soothe a crying baby. She gave him supplies, cloth for diapers, a better blanket, a proper bottle. Reverend Crawford taught him different lessons. About the world Isaiah was entering, the dangerous space between slavery and freedom. About how to behave as a free black man in a society that assumed all black people were property. About the constant need for papers, for explanation, for justification of his existence. "You're carrying a white baby," Reverend Crawford said bluntly on the third day. "That's going to raise questions everywhere you go. White folks will assume you stole her, that you're a runaway, that you're dangerous. Black folks will wonder why you're protecting your master's child. You need a better story than 'my wife died.' You need something that makes sense to both communities." Together, they crafted a more elaborate backstory. Josiah Freeman had been enslaved, but purchased his freedom through years of labor. He married a free, light-skinned woman named Sarah. She died in childbirth, leaving him with their daughter Emma. He was traveling to Ohio, where he had relatives and the promise of work. It was a common enough story to be believable, detailed enough to answer questions, sad enough to discourage too much curiosity. On the fourth day, Isaiah left the Crawfords with Emma, now healthier, and continued north. But something had changed during those 3 days. He had begun to see Emma not as the Harlan baby, not as a burden he was obligated to protect, but as a small human being completely dependent on him. A child who looked at him with trust, who stopped crying when he held her, who reached for him with small hands. He was becoming, despite himself, despite everything, her father. The journey to the north took 6 weeks. Isaiah traveled through Tennessee, Kentucky, finally crossing the Ohio River in late December 1851. Ohio was technically a free state, but it was also full of slave catchers, bounty hunters who captured fugitive slaves and returned them south for reward money. Isaiah knew he wasn't safe, would never truly be safe, but he was safer than he had been. He settled in a small black community outside Cincinnati called Freeman's Crossing. It was a settlement of about 50 people, mostly fugitive slaves and free black families, who had created a mutual protection society. Newcomers were vetted carefully, questioned extensively, but also protected once accepted into the community. Isaiah, now fully inhabiting his identity as Josiah Freeman, told his story to the community elders. They suspected it wasn't entirely true, but they also recognized a man trying to protect a child, and that counted for something. They allowed him to stay, helped him build a small cabin, introduced him to people who needed carpentry work. Building a new life, 15 to 18 minutes. The first winter in Ohio was brutally cold. Isaiah's small cabin had gaps in the walls that let in freezing wind. Emma, now almost a year old, developed a cough that lasted weeks. Isaiah worked during the day doing carpentry, earning small amounts of money, then stayed up nights keeping the fire burning, keeping Emma warm, worrying that this child he had saved from murder might die from cold and poverty anyway. But Emma survived. By spring 1852, she was walking, beginning to speak simple words, developing a personality. She called Isaiah Papa, the first word she learned, and something in Isaiah's chest tightened every time he heard it. The community of Freeman's Crossing functioned through mutual aid. Neighbors helped with childcare when Isaiah worked. Older women taught him more about raising a young child. Men helped him improve his cabin, making it warmer and more secure. Slowly, Isaiah built something he had never had in his entire life. A community that wasn't based on ownership, but on cooperation. During Emma's second year, Isaiah began to experience something he hadn't anticipated: attachment. He found himself thinking about Emma constantly while working, worrying about her health, her happiness, her future, planning small surprises for her, carving wooden toys, saving money to buy a real doll for her birthday. He was becoming what he had set out to be: her father. But the contradiction haunted him. He had killed her entire family. Her mother, her brothers, her sister. If Emma ever learned the truth, she would hate him. She would see him as the monster who destroyed her life, not the man who saved it. Isaiah began keeping a journal during this period. He had learned to write from his mother, who had been taught by a sympathetic mistress before being sold to the Harlans. His writing was crude but functional. He documented his thoughts, his fears, his growing love for Emma, and his constant anxiety about what would happen when she was old enough to ask questions about her past. One entry from May 1852 read, "Emma smiled at me today when I came home from work. A real smile, not just gas or reflex, but recognition and joy. She was happy to see me. She trusts me completely, loves me without reservation. I am her whole world, and I am built on lies and blood. How long can I sustain this? How long before she asks about her mother, her family, her history? What do I tell her? That I am the man who murdered everyone she should have known? That her father by blood wanted to sell me, and her father by choice killed him for it?" As Emma grew, the questions came earlier than Isaiah expected. At 3 years old, she began asking about her mother. Where was Mama? Why didn't she have a mama like other children? Isaiah told her the story he had prepared. That her mother died when she was a baby. That she had been a good woman who loved Emma very much. That she was in heaven watching over them. Emma accepted this explanation with the simple faith of a child. She asked more questions about this woman she'd never known. What did she look like? What was her name? Did she sing songs? Isaiah found himself inventing a woman who had never existed, creating a detailed fantasy of Emma's mother based on every kind woman he had ever known. The lies multiplied. Emma asked where they came from, why they had come to Ohio. Isaiah told her they had lived in Tennessee, that he was a carpenter, that they moved north for better opportunities. Simple lies, believable lies, but lies nonetheless. The community of Freeman's Crossing was protective of its secrets. Most people there were fugitive slaves with invented identities and complicated pasts. They understood Isaiah's reluctance to discuss his history, and they didn't press. But they also noticed that Emma was remarkably light-skinned, that she didn't look like Isaiah's biological daughter, that something about their story didn't quite align. One evening in 1854, when Emma was 3 years old, an older woman named Hannah pulled Isaiah aside after a community gathering. Hannah had been enslaved for 40 years before escaping north. She had survived horrors that had left permanent scars on her body and soul. She looked at Isaiah with eyes that had seen everything. "That child isn't yours by blood," Hannah said quietly. It wasn't a question. Isaiah considered denying it, but something in Hannah's expression told him she already knew that she was offering understanding rather than accusation. "No," he admitted, "she isn't. But you love her. More than I thought possible." Hannah nodded slowly. "Children are strange things. They don't care about blood or history. They care about who feeds them, who comforts them when they cry, who teaches them to walk and talk. You're her father, in every way that matters. Don't forget that when the past comes looking for you, because it always does." By 1856, Emma was 5 years old and Isaiah was 31. They had been together for 5 years, longer than many biological father-daughter relationships in that era, where death and separation were common. To the community, they were simply Josiah and Emma Freeman, a carpenter and his daughter. But Isaiah was changing in ways he didn't fully understand. The man who had methodically killed 5 people now found himself terrified by the thought of Emma getting a minor injury. The man who had felt only cold determination now experienced waves of love so intense they physically hurt. The man who had seen only justice and revenge now saw only a small girl who needed protection, guidance, and love. Emma was bright, curious, constantly asking questions about everything. Why was the sky blue? Where did rain come from? Why did some people have dark skin and others light skin? Each question was innocent, but many touched on subjects that made Isaiah deeply uncomfortable. The question of race was particularly complicated. Emma was white by appearance, but raised by a black man in a black community. Other children sometimes commented on this difference, asking Emma why her papa looked different from her. Emma, with a child's straightforward logic, simply responded that families came in different colors, that love was more important than appearance. But Isaiah knew this innocence wouldn't last forever. As Emma grew older, she would encounter a society that categorized people strictly by race, that would see her as white and him as black, that would question and ultimately condemn their relationship. Isaiah began teaching Emma to read and write when she was 4 years old, using the skills his mother had taught him. They would sit together in the evenings by firelight, Emma tracing letters in sand, sounding out words. She was a quick learner, absorbing information like a sponge, and Isaiah felt pride in her accomplishments, mixed with a deep melancholy he couldn't quite name. In the spring of 1856, a traveling preacher came through Freeman's Crossing. Reverend Thomas Bradley was a white abolitionist from Massachusetts who traveled through black communities offering religious services and news from the broader anti-slavery movement. He stayed in the community for a week, and during that time he noticed Isaiah and Emma. One afternoon, Reverend Bradley approached Isaiah while Emma played nearby with other children. The preacher's expression was kind but curious. "That's a beautiful daughter you have," Bradley said, watching Emma laugh as she chased another child. "Thank you," Isaiah replied carefully. "She doesn't look much like you." Isaiah had prepared for this conversation many times. Her mother was light-skinned. Emma takes after her. Bradley nodded, but his eyes remained thoughtful. It must be difficult, raising a white-appearing child in this community. Have you considered what will happen as she grows older? How she'll navigate a society that will see her as white while you're seen as black? Isaiah had considered this constantly. It haunted his dreams, shaped every decision he made. "I don't know," he admitted. "I take each day as it comes." "You're a good father," Bradley said after a moment. "That's clear in how she looks at you, how she runs to you when she's frightened. Whatever your story is, whatever brought you two together, you're doing right by that child. Remember that." The conversation stayed with Isaiah for weeks. He began to realize that his greatest fear wasn't that Emma would discover the truth about her family's death. His greatest fear was that she would grow up and choose the white world over him, that society would pull her away, that he would lose her not to death or discovery, but to the simple fact that they lived in a world that would never accept their family. In the fall of 1856, something happened that forced Isaiah to confront the contradictions of his situation more directly. A slave catcher appeared in Freeman's Crossing, claiming that several fugitive slaves were hiding in the community. The slave catcher, a man named Horace Dillard, had legal authority to search for and capture runaway slaves under the Fugitive Slave Act. The community protected its own. Men armed themselves, women hid children, and everyone closed ranks against the intruder. Dillard, faced with united resistance, eventually left without capturing anyone. But the incident left everyone shaken, reminded them that freedom in Ohio was conditional, that the South's power extended north through law and violence. During the slave catcher's visit, Emma asked Isaiah a question that cut straight to his heart. "Papa, why did that man want to take people away? Where would he take them?" Isaiah had to explain slavery to his 5-year-old daughter. He had to tell her that some people believed they could own other people, that black people in particular were often enslaved, that the South was a place where people like him had no rights, no freedom, no protection from cruelty. Emma listened with wide eyes, then asked the question Isaiah had been dreading. "Did someone own you once, Papa? Is that why we left Tennessee?" Isaiah paused, choosing his words carefully. "Yes," he said. "I was enslaved when I was younger. I escaped and came north to be free." "Were the people who owned you mean to you?" Isaiah thought about Marcus Harlan, about William and Robert, about Judith's cold indifference and Catherine's casual cruelty. "Yes," he said quietly. "They were very mean." Emma was silent for a moment, processing this information. Then she wrapped her small arms around Isaiah's neck and said, "I'm glad you escaped, Papa. I'm glad you're free now. I'm glad we're together." Isaiah held her, this child of his enemies, this daughter of his heart, and felt tears he couldn't stop. He had killed to be free. He had destroyed an entire family to escape bondage. And now he was holding the last survivor of that family, loving her more than he had ever loved anyone, while she comforted him for the suffering her birth family had inflicted. The contradiction was unbearable. But it was also his reality, the truth he would carry for the rest of his life. In 1858, when Emma was 7 years old, the past began catching up to them. A newspaper from Georgia found its way to Freeman's Crossing, brought by a traveler passing through. The paper was 2 years old, dated December 1851, and it contained an article about the Harlan family tragedy. "Mysterious fire destroys Harlan homestead," the headline read. The article described how the Harlan family, prominent farmers in northern Georgia, had been killed in their home. The bodies were badly burned, making it difficult to determine the exact cause of death. The house had been set ablaze, presumably by the same criminals who committed the murders. The article noted that one member of the family, an infant daughter named Emma Harlan, was missing and presumed kidnapped. Also missing was a slave named Isaiah, who authorities believed might have information about the crime. A reward of $300 was offered for information leading to the recovery of Emma Harlan or the capture of Isaiah. Isaiah read the article with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold the paper. After 7 years, he had almost convinced himself that the past was truly gone, that he and Emma had successfully escaped into new identities. But here was proof that someone was still looking, still investigating, still offering rewards. More troubling, the article included descriptions. Emma Harlan, infant, light hair, blue eyes, small birthmark on left shoulder. Isaiah, male, approximately 23 years old, tall, strong build, skilled carpenter, intelligent, possibly traveling with the missing infant. Isaiah checked Emma's left shoulder that night while helping her prepare for bed. The birthmark was there exactly as described, a small brown mark shaped like a crescent moon. It was distinctive, identifiable, evidence that could connect her to the Harlan family if anyone made the connection. Hannah noticed Isaiah's distress. She had seen the newspaper article too, had done the arithmetic in her head. She approached him the next day while Emma was at school, a small schoolhouse that the black community had established for their children. "You need to leave," Hannah said without preamble. That article is 7 years old, but someone brought it here, which means people are talking, remembering. It's only a matter of time before someone makes the connection. That birthmark, the timing, the fact that you appeared in Ohio in winter 1851 with a white infant. People will put it together. Where would we go? Isaiah asked. Emma's happy here. She has friends, a school, a community. I can't just uproot her again. You can't stay here and wait to be found, Hannah replied. They're offering $300. That's enough money to tempt even good people into betrayal, and if they catch you, they'll hang you for murder and kidnapping. And Emma, they'll take her back to whatever relatives survived, raise her to hate you, tell her you're a monster. Isaiah knew Hannah was right. But the thought of running again, of dragging Emma into another upheaval, felt unbearable. She was 7 years old, thriving in the only home she consciously remembered. How could he explain why they needed to leave? That night, Isaiah sat down with Emma and told her they needed to have a serious conversation. Emma, sensing his anxiety, climbed into his lap and waited. Emma, Isaiah began, do you remember what I told you about being enslaved when I was younger? Emma nodded. The mean people who owned you. Yes. Well, those people, they might still be looking for me. Which means we might need to leave Freeman's Crossing and find somewhere safer to live. Emma's face crumpled. But I don't want to leave. My friends are here. My school is here. Why do we have to go? Because sometimes the past doesn't let go of us, even when we want it to. I don't care about the past, Emma said, tears streaming down her face. I only care about now, about being here with you. Can't we just stay? Please. Isaiah held her while she cried, feeling his heart break. This was the moment he had feared for 7 years. The moment when his past and her present collided, when the choices he made before she could remember them began destroying the life they had built together. They stayed in Freeman's Crossing for 3 more months, but the atmosphere changed. People looked at Isaiah differently. Conversations stopped when he approached. Parents began keeping their children away from Emma, not out of hostility toward her, but from fear of association with a wanted man. In March 1859, the situation reached a breaking point. A bounty hunter appeared in Cincinnati, asking questions about fugitive slaves in the surrounding areas. He had a copy of the same newspaper article, and he was specifically inquiring about a black man traveling with a white child. The community sent word to Isaiah. Leave now, tonight, before the bounty hunter traced connections to Freeman's Crossing. Isaiah packed their few possessions, took Emma by the hand, and left in the darkness, heading further north toward Canada. They traveled for 2 weeks, sleeping in barns and abandoned buildings, accepting help from sympathetic abolitionists along the Underground Railroad. Emma, now 8 years old, asked questions constantly. Why were they running? Who was chasing them? What had Papa done that made people want to hurt him? Isaiah deflected, evaded, told partial truths. But Emma was getting older, more perceptive, less willing to accept vague answers. She knew something was fundamentally wrong, that the story she'd been told about her life didn't quite match reality. They reached Detroit in early April 1859, planning to cross into Canada within days. They stayed with a Quaker family, the Johnsons, who operated a safe house for fugitive slaves. Mrs. Johnson, a kind woman in her 50s, took an immediate liking to Emma, commenting on how well-behaved and intelligent she was. On their 3rd night in Detroit, Emma couldn't sleep. She came downstairs and found Isaiah sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the newspaper article that had haunted him for months. Emma saw the paper before Isaiah could hide it. "What's that, Papa?" Isaiah considered lying, but he was tired of lies, tired of evasion, tired of carrying the weight of secrets that grew heavier every year. "It's a newspaper article from Georgia, about something that happened a long time ago." Emma picked up the paper and began reading. She was a good reader now, capable of understanding most of what she saw. Isaiah watched her eyes move across the text, saw the moment she reached the description of Emma Harlan, saw her process the information, saw understanding dawn. "This baby they're talking about," Emma said slowly. "The one who was kidnapped. This is me, isn't it?" Isaiah couldn't speak. He simply nodded. "So Harlan is my real name, not Freeman?" "Yes. And these people who died, the Harlan family, they were my real family. My mother, my brothers, my sister." "Yes." Emma was silent for a long time, staring at the paper. When she finally looked up at Isaiah, her expression was a complicated mixture of confusion, hurt, and fear. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you lie about my mother, about where we came from, about everything?" "Because I was trying to protect you," Isaiah said quietly. "Because the truth is complicated and terrible, and I didn't want to burden you with it." "What's the truth?" This was the moment Isaiah had dreaded for 8 years, the moment when he would have to tell this child, whom he loved more than his own life, that he had murdered her entire family. "The Harlan family," Isaiah began, his voice breaking. "They were the people who enslaved me. Your father, Marcus Harlan, owned me. Your brothers, William and Robert, they were cruel men who hurt people for entertainment. Your mother and sister, they participated in a system that treated people like me as property, as things to be used and discarded." Emma listened, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "One of their enslaved people was a woman named Sarah. She had a son named Thomas. Thomas was 5 years old. Your brother, William. He killed Thomas. He tortured him and killed him over a broken window, and no one did anything. No one punished him. No one cared that a 5-year-old boy died because of cruelty and indifference." "So you killed them," Emma said quietly. It wasn't a question. Isaiah looked at this 8-year-old child, this girl he had raised, who was staring at him with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than her years. "Yes," he said. "I killed them. All of them except you. I killed your family, Emma. And then I took you with me because you were innocent, because you were a baby who had done nothing wrong, because I couldn't leave you to die." Emma stood up from the table, backing away from Isaiah as if he were a stranger, as if she were seeing him for the first time. "You killed my mother," she said, her voice small and broken. "Yes. My brothers. My sister. Yes. And then you pretended to be my father. You lied to me every day for 8 years." "I didn't pretend to be your father," Isaiah said, tears streaming down his face. "I became your father. I raised you. I loved you. I protected you. Everything I've done for 8 years has been real, Emma. Everything except the stories I told you about your past." Emma started crying, deep sobs that shook her small body. "I don't know who you are anymore. I don't know who I am. Everything is a lie." Mrs. Johnson appeared in the doorway, awakened by the noise. She took in the scene quickly. The newspaper article, Isaiah's devastated expression, Emma's tears. She moved to Emma, putting a protective arm around the girl, and looked at Isaiah with an expression that mixed sympathy and horror. "I think," Mrs. Johnson said gently, "that Emma should sleep in our room tonight. Give everyone time to process this." Emma allowed herself to be led away, looking back once at Isaiah with an expression he couldn't read. Confusion, betrayal, fear, grief, all of those things at once. Isaiah sat alone in the kitchen until dawn, staring at the newspaper article that had destroyed his world, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake 8 years ago when he decided to spare Emma's life and raise her as his own. The next 3 days were the worst of Isaiah's life. Emma refused to speak to him, refused to look at him, stayed close to Mrs. Johnson at all times. She was processing trauma that no 8-year-old should have to face, learning that everything she knew about her identity was false. that the man she called Papa had killed her biological family, that her entire existence was built on blood and lies. Mr. Johnson, a thoughtful Quaker who had helped hundreds of fugitive slaves reach freedom, sat with Isaiah on the second day and tried to offer perspective. "What you did," Johnson said carefully, "taking that child, raising her, loving her, that wasn't the crime. The crime was committed by her family, by the system of slavery they upheld. You were seeking justice in the only way available to you." "I killed 5 people," Isaiah said flatly, "including a 15-year-old girl. How is that justice?" "I don't know," Johnson admitted. "I believe in non-violence, in turning the other cheek. But I've also seen what slavery does to people, the horrors it creates, the brutality it normalizes. I can't judge you for fighting back against that system, even though I wish you had found another way. Emma judges me, and she has every right to. Emma is 8 years old and just learned that her entire life is a lie. She's hurt and confused and angry. Give her time." But time seemed to make things worse, not better. On the third day, Emma finally spoke to Isaiah, but her words cut deeper than any silence. "I wish you had left me there," she said, her voice cold. "I wish you had killed me with the others. Then I wouldn't have to know that the person I love most in the world is a murderer. That every time you held me, every time you told me you loved me, it was all built on what you did to my real family." "You were a baby," Isaiah said desperately. "You were innocent. I couldn't kill a baby, Emma. I couldn't do it. So instead you made me love you. You made me call you Papa. You made me think you were the only family I had, when really you're the reason I have no family at all." Isaiah had no response to this. She was right. He had killed her family and then manipulated her into loving him, into accepting him as her father. The fact that his love for her was genuine didn't change the fundamental wrong of what he had done. That night, Mrs. Johnson came to speak with Isaiah privately. "Emma asked me if she could stay here with us," she said. "She doesn't want to go to Canada with you. She wants to start over, away from you, with a new family who didn't murder her old one." Isaiah felt as if he'd been stabbed. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that I needed to think about it, to pray on it, to discuss it with my husband. But Isaiah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. If Emma chooses to stay with us, if she chooses to reject you and start a new life, will you let her go?" Isaiah thought about Emma as an infant, crying in his arms as they fled the burning Harlan house. He thought about teaching her to walk, to talk, to read. He thought about every moment of joy and fear and love over the past 8 years. He thought about how completely she had become his daughter, the center of his entire existence. And he thought about what was best for her, not for him. "Yes," he said finally. "If that's what she truly wants, after she's had time to process everything, I'll let her go. I won't force her to stay with me, won't force her to love someone who killed her family. I love her too much to trap her in that kind of pain." Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. "That's what I hoped you'd say. That's how I know that whatever else you are, you truly are her father in the ways that matter." Isaiah prepared to leave Detroit alone. He would cross into Canada, start over again, carry the weight of Emma's rejection for the rest of his life. The Johnsons had agreed to take Emma in, to raise her as their own, to give her a chance at a life not defined by the violence that had brought her and Isaiah together. On the morning Isaiah was scheduled to leave, he went to say goodbye to Emma. She was in the garden behind the Johnson house, sitting on a bench, staring at flowers. She looked so small, so fragile, so alone. "Emma," Isaiah said softly, "I'm leaving today. I wanted to say goodbye." Emma didn't look at him. "Okay." Isaiah sat down on the bench beside her, careful not to touch her, respecting her space. "I want you to know," he said, "that I'm sorry for lying to you, for not telling you the truth sooner, for putting you in a position where you had to love someone who did terrible things. You deserved better than that." Emma was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Johnson told me about Thomas, about what happened to him." "Yes. She said he was 5 years old, the same age I was when you taught me to read. Yes. If my brother William did that, if he killed a little boy for no reason, then he was bad, really bad." Isaiah didn't know where she was going with this. He simply waited. "And if my father and mother let him do that, if they didn't punish him or stop him, then they were bad too. Right? They were products of a system," Isaiah said carefully. "A system that told them they could own people, that black lives didn't matter, that cruelty toward enslaved people was acceptable. They were wrong, Emma. What they did was evil. But they were also shaped by a society that normalized that evil." Emma finally looked at him. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something else in them now. Thought, consideration, the beginning of understanding. "The man who killed my family," she said slowly, "he was also a product of that system. He was shaped by it, hurt by it, driven to do terrible things because of it. Right?" Isaiah saw where she was going and felt his heart break all over again. "Yes. But the man who raised me, who taught me to read."
Emma was quiet again, working through thoughts too complex for an 8-year-old, trying to reconcile two incompatible truths about the man sitting beside her. "I'm angry at you," she said finally. "I'm so angry, and I'm sad, and I'm confused, and I don't know if I can forgive you for what you did to my family. I understand, but I also don't want you to leave, because even though you killed them, you also saved me. And even though you lied to me, you also love me. And even though everything is terrible and confusing, you're still my papa, and I don't want to lose you." Isaiah couldn't hold back his tears anymore. "I don't want to lose you either. Mrs. Johnson said that families are complicated, that sometimes people hurt each other and still love each other, that sometimes the right choice isn't clear, that we have to live with contradictions and confusion. Is that true?" "Yes, it's true." Emma reached out tentatively and took Isaiah's hand. It was the first time she'd voluntarily touched him since learning the truth. "Can I still call you Papa? If you want to, even though you're not my real father?" Isaiah thought about what made someone a real father. Was it blood, or was it the daily acts of care, the sacrifices, the love that grew through years of shared life? "I am your real father," he said. "Maybe not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the 8 years we've lived together. Blood doesn't make family, Emma. Love does." Emma leaned against him, and Isaiah wrapped his arms around her, holding her gently as if she might break. They sat like that for a long time in the garden, crying together, beginning the long process of healing wounds that would never fully close. "I think," Emma said eventually, "that I want to come with you to Canada. I don't want to stay here without you, but I also need you to promise me something. Anything. Promise that you'll never lie to me again. That if I ask you something, you'll tell me the truth, even if it's hard. I need to be able to trust you. I promise. And promise that you'll tell me stories about my real family. Not lies, but the truth about who they were. The good things and the bad things. Because they're part of me too, even if I never knew them." Isaiah hesitated. Telling Emma about her family meant confronting the full horror of what he'd done, meant helping her understand people he had killed. But she deserved the truth. "I promise," he said again. Isaiah and Emma crossed into Canada in April 1859 and settled in a small black community outside Toronto. They lived simply, Isaiah working as a carpenter, Emma attending school. They were known as Josiah and Emma Freeman, a father and daughter who had escaped slavery and started over in freedom. But their relationship was forever changed by the truth Emma had learned. The easy, uncomplicated love of her childhood was gone, replaced by something more complex and more real. Emma loved Isaiah, but she also carried grief for a family she had never known, anger at the system that had created such tragedy, and confusion about her own identity. Isaiah kept his promises. When Emma asked questions about her biological family, he answered honestly. He told her that her mother, Judith, loved music and played piano, that her sister, Catherine, was good at needlework, that her brothers were intelligent, even if they used that intelligence for cruelty. He gave her pieces of her history, even when it hurt both of them. As Emma grew older, the complexity of their situation deepened. She looked white and was treated as white by Canadian society, while Isaiah was treated as black. She had access to opportunities he would never have. She could go places, do things, meet people that were denied to him because of his race. When Emma was 12, she asked Isaiah the hardest question yet. Do you regret killing them? If you could go back, would you do it differently? Isaiah thought for a long time before answering. I regret that I became capable of killing, he said finally. I regret that the world made me into someone who could do what I did. I regret that violence seemed like the only option, the only way to stop the cruelty and seek justice. But do I regret saving you? Do I regret that you're alive, that we have this life together, complicated as it is? No, I don't regret that. But if you hadn't killed them, my mother might have raised me. My brothers might have protected me. I might have had a different life. You might have, Isaiah agreed, but you also might have been raised to see people like me as property. You might have learned to be cruel, to perpetuate the system your family upheld. You might have grown up believing that some humans are worth less than others because of the color of their skin. I couldn't let that happen, not to you. So you killed them to save my soul. Emma's voice was sharp, challenging. I killed them because they murdered a 5-year-old child and felt no remorse. I saved you because you were innocent. The two things are connected but separate. I don't expect you to thank me for either decision. Emma was silent for a while, processing this. Sometimes I hate you, she said quietly. Sometimes I look at you and I hate that I love you, that I can't stop loving you, that you're the most important person in my world even though you destroyed my first world. I know, Isaiah said. I understand. But I also know that I'm alive because of you, that I can read and write because you taught me, that I know what kindness is because you showed me, that I understand justice, even complicated justice, because of our story. So I hate you and I love you and I'm grateful and I'm angry, all at the same time. That's okay, Isaiah told her. You're allowed to feel all of those things. They're all true. As Emma reached adulthood, their relationship evolved again. She married a kind man, a teacher named David Williams, and they had children. Isaiah became a grandfather, playing with Emma's children in the same way he had once played with her. Emma's children knew Isaiah as Grandpa Josiah, a gentle old man who carved them toys and told them stories. They didn't know the full truth of how he and Emma had come together. Emma had decided to spare them that burden until they were old enough to understand complexity and contradiction. But Emma never forgot, and Isaiah never forgot. They carried their shared history like a weight that couldn't be set down, only redistributed and balanced differently as years passed. In 1875, when Isaiah was 49 and Emma was 24, they had a conversation that would be their last about the events of November 1851. Emma had given birth to her third child, a daughter she named Ruth after Isaiah's mother, a woman Emma had never met. Do you think what you did was right? Emma asked as they sat together, watching her children play. Isaiah had thought about this question for 24 years, through every moment of joy and pain he'd shared with Emma. I don't know if it was right, he said, but I know it was necessary. I know that if I hadn't acted, Thomas would still be dead, Sarah would still be dead, my mother would still have died in those fields, and nothing would have changed. Violence is terrible, but sometimes it's the only language that power understands. And me? Was taking me necessary? Isaiah looked at Emma, this woman who was so different from the baby he'd carried out of a burning house, and so fundamentally the same. Necessary for what? For my soul? For your life? For proving that love can exist even in the darkest circumstances? Yes. You were necessary. You are necessary. You taught me that I could do something terrible and still be capable of good, that I could destroy and also create, that humanity isn't simple, isn't pure, isn't easily categorized. Emma smiled, tears in her eyes. You taught me that too, that people can be both monster and father, both murderer and savior, both the worst thing that ever happened to my family and the best thing that ever happened to me. They sat in silence, watching Emma's children play, carrying their complicated history together. Two people bound by blood and violence, and love and choice. Isaiah died in 1879 at the age of 53. Emma was with him at the end, holding his hand, telling him she loved him, thanking him for her life. His last words to her were simple. I'm sorry and I'm not sorry, both things at once. Emma lived until 1910, and in her final years she began writing down the story of her life with Isaiah. Not to publish, not to share widely, but to leave for her children and grandchildren so they would understand the complexity of their heritage. She wrote, "The man who raised me killed my family. This is a fact I have had to live with every day of my life. But the man who raised me also loved me, protected me, taught me, and gave me a life of freedom and dignity. This is also a fact. Both truths exist simultaneously. Both are real. History wants simple stories, heroes and villains, right and wrong. But life is more complicated than that. My father Isaiah was both the man who committed one of the worst acts imaginable and the man who committed one of the greatest acts of love I've ever known. He was both, and I was shaped by both. I forgave him, though he never asked for forgiveness. I loved him, though that love was always complicated by knowledge of what he had done. I mourned him when he died, and I mourned the family I never knew, and I held both griefs together in my heart.